So we'll go ahead and get started. Jack, thank you so much for coming in today and sharing with us all of your knowledge about cyber liability insurance. And thank you everyone that
Happy to
is
be here.
currently attending this webinar session. My name is Heather Martz Keller. I am a marketing associate here at DTC. So if you don't know exactly what that is, DTC is an IT company. We specifically are a managed service provider that serves multiple clients in multiple different sectors. I would also like to let everyone know that we will be hosting our webinar series once a month. So this one being our second ever. We're still working out the kinks, but it is very exciting. If you have registered in the past or registered for this specific webinar, you will get notifications in the future for all of our future webinars as well. So hopefully we will see you again then. And again, I would just like to thank you, Jack, for coming in today. Just a quick introduction of Jack, and he can go on more later. He is the president and CEO of JLK Group. And let's see if I can change the slide. There we go. He graduated and got his degree from Loyola College in business with a specialization in marketing. And after graduation, he was introduced to the insurance industry. His passion for these businesses and professionals really led him to grow and excel in this field. And eventually he was able to start his own firm. So without further ado, Jack, you can take it over and give your introduction, and then we can get going with the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Heather. And thank you, Steve, for having me on, and certainly TDC or DTC for coordinating today's talk and on cyber. As Heather mentioned, my name is Jack Kohlenstein, President and CEO of JLK Group, and we specialize in providing insurance solutions for dental practices and medical practices, oral surgery practices, et cetera. Really happy to be able to present to you guys today on a topic that is becoming such a bigger issue in the insurance world, and that is cyber liability insurance, and being able to coordinate with you guys to have both sides of the equation, the insurance side and the IT side, I think is just such a huge opportunity to present. So with that, let's go ahead and get started.
All right. So like Jack said, we are presenting cyber liability insurance in today's digital world. So Jack, what exactly is cyber liability insurance?
Cyber liability insurance is it's a newer type of policy. It's a newer type of insurance. When I say new, I mean in the general scheme of insurance, it is newer, and it is an insurance policy specifically designed to insure against a cyber threat or a cyber attack. We hear about them in the news quite frequently. Typically, we hear about them in the larger organizations, the larger corporations, when they face a breach. What we don't typically hear about are the smaller businesses, the smaller practices, and they're getting attacked all the time. And that's why it's so critical to carry this type of policy. And it is specifically designed to cover against these types of attacks. Just a couple of them: ransom attacks, which you guys may be familiar with, phishing email schemes, malicious cyber attacks, or an attack that may be designed to specifically extract client or patient information so that it can be sold on the black market. That's how these criminals make their money, either typically by ransom or a black market sale of that information.
So what is the average cost of a data breach to a company then?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a tough. Actually, this goes right in line with how much coverage should I have, and it's difficult to determine. And really, we've seen attacks that have cost as low as $50,000. It can be a ransom attack that is $50,000, but we've also seen them as high as millions of dollars. And it really depends on the type of attack that is occurring, the breach that occurred, and what information was compromised, and what are the legal responsibilities that the practice or the business has and how much of that information was compromised. Typically, we see the cost per record of anywhere from $150 to $250 per record. This is kind of a ballpark of what we're seeing right now.
And why do you need cyber liability insurance?
To sleep at night. It's so that you can close your eyes and just know that if something were to happen, you've got something there that you can fall back on, and experts that it can be in your corner to be there for you if you ever need them. Honestly, I mean, if an attack were to occur, the very first thing that this policy is going to do is it's going to hire an attorney to figure out what your legal responsibilities are in the event of a breach. It'll pay for the forensics to figure out what information was potentially compromised, how it was used, and if it's potentially out there for sale on the black market, and then start to really be compliant with all of the regulations that are out there. If it needs to pay a ransom, it'll pay a ransom, and it'll help negotiate those terms.
Perfect. So what do you need to do to obtain a cyber liability insurance?
Cyber liability insurance is just like any other policy from the standpoint of it's just that it's an application. So there's an application that you would apply for coverage, select your limits, fill out some basic information about your business or your practice. There are going to be some questions on that application that are specific to data breach and cyber and IT. One of the things that we're seeing right now is all carriers are asking, are you affiliating with or are you using a third-party IT professional, such as yourself? They really don't want to see, you're doing it yourself, or you're just downloading, whatever free antivirus software is available. They want to know that there's a professional that you're working with that is monitoring and staying up to date with all the latest advancements in security, IT security, firewalls, antivirus software, etc. One of the biggest things that we're seeing right now, and actually is kind of more recent, is they want to see two-factor authentication, 2FA, or multi-factor authentication. It's all the same thing. It's just those are the different terms that are used to describe it. But basically what that does is it requires kind of like a separate code if you're logging in from a different device for the first time. So, Steve, I don't know if you have anything else to add to the 2FA requirement that we're seeing.
No, I mean, the 2FA is becoming more necessary, and it just adds a layer of, I think it adds a layer of confusion for the layperson, because what it does is it literally makes your day a little bit more complicated. Mm-hmm. People just want to be able to log in and go like we did 10 years ago. Everybody had the same username and password, user. And none of those things are acceptable anymore. So it is a little bit more cumbersome. It's a little bit more difficult in some applications to do than in others. But what's happened in today's world, obviously, is that if your security is not up to speed, then you become the low-lying fruit. And that's literally what everybody's after. So,
yeah, and that's exactly why the insurance companies, they want to see that those extra measures taken, because if you're not doing it, I mean, that's basically the standard now. They want to see those things.
So we kind of already went over this, but what types of things are typically covered under the cyber liability policy?
Yeah, great question. And, this is a list of things that are typically covered. Ransom, of course, cyber extortion. I know you might be looking at those two things and think, well, wait a minute, what's the difference? Ransom is when there's actually a demand for money in return for the release of information. So they've actually locked out your system. Cyber extortion is the threat against your system. Say somebody's been able to get in and actually compromise your system, but they haven't done it yet. They're just extorting you. They say, pay me money or I'm going to launch a cyber attack against you. If you don't have cyber extortion as an endorsement or a specifically itemized coverage on your policy, it's not covered until they actually do something. So it's a very important coverage item there. But notifying patients of a breach, if there is a breach, credit monitoring if it is required by law, and legal expenses, where you hire an attorney to figure out what are your responsibilities in the event of breach. Are some of the top things that would be covered.
So Jack, on this particular topic, if somebody gets hit with, they get a ransom demand, do the insurance companies, will they do any negotiation on that ransom as well? Is that something that happens and is covered under a policy, or do they just pay the ransom?
No, they do negotiations as well. And, you know, it's very odd. The first time that I actually encountered this and experienced this, these cyber criminals are more like cyber criminal organizations. I mean, in my experience, limited experience with, you know, having to deal with this is, and oftentimes when an insurance company, they hire the people to negotiate with them, it's typically not the first time that they've encountered a group that has launched a cyber attack. So when they are talking to them, there's negotiations that are going on. We see behind the scenes, and it's oftentimes they've actually dealt with these people before and have negotiated with them before to get the release of those records and that patient information. And it seems very odd to operate that way, but that's the way that we see it happens.
Yeah, I think one other thing to add here too is that in some of the cases that we've seen, the actors that are actually performing these threats or ransoms, they're actually living on these servers for days and sometimes weeks before they actually launch their attack. So they've laid the groundwork and they've been just kind of lurking in the weeds for a while. So when they launch it, it's not like, oh, well, you can just flip a switch and you'll be good. I mean, they're infiltrated days and weeks prior to them actually launching the attack. So it's a pretty sophisticated thing. And the one thing I would caution anybody is if you ever have one of these, don't wait. Like whatever you do, don't think, well, let me see what I can do about this. Contact your insurance agent immediately and get the professionals involved as soon as you possibly can, because the longer they go, the worse they become.
And absolutely. As soon as you know that something's wrong with your system, contact your insurance company, contact your agent, whoever you're working with immediately. I can't emphasize that enough. Thank you, Steve. But also if you wait too long, there can be reporting requirements built into your policy. So if you do in fact wait too long, you could trigger an exclusion. If you try to resolve it yourself and you head down a path that's not favorable for the insurance company, I mean, yeah, they have the experts for a reason. Just let them do their job.
Yes.
So what are the most important items not covered by the cyber liability insurance?
So these are, I listed out a couple of things here that are not typically covered, but can be covered. So when you see this list, don't think, oh my gosh, I don't have coverage for any of these. These are important things that you need to be making sure. You need to be asking your representative, does my cyber insurance policy cover these items? BYOD, bring your own data or bring your own device. I think that in 2020, this became even more important as everybody where more people were working from home using personal devices, using personal phones, laptops, home computers, and remoting into, a secured network. That family computer is also used by a son or a daughter, and it could download a game that also downloads a virus that as soon as that remote in, boom, gotcha. So making sure that the coverage doesn't just include the devices that are inside of the network, but it includes coverage for the devices that are outside of the network and coming in. It's so big now, and that's not going to change. I think that 2020 and COVID changed the dynamics of the way that people work, and then that's just going to be a bigger issue moving forward. Regulatory fines and penalties, they can be covered under a policy. Just make sure that they're covered. Bricking is something that may or may not be covered under your cyber policy, but it can be, and that is basically the destruction of a physical computer. If there's just a malicious attack and it crashes your servers and the network, and you have damaged hardware because of that, is the actual damaged hardware covered, or are they just going to worry, or is the policy just going to be more worried about the data and protecting the data? That's those servers, the cost of that can be expensive. You're going to want coverage for that. Social engineering, that's just a fancy way of saying they tricked you into sending them money. That's basically what that is, and it's much more sophisticated than a distant relative in a foreign country. The way that they are getting access to your email servers or your network, and pretending to be somebody maybe inside of the company, and asking for a money or a transfer or wire, even something as simple as gift cards to a client. That we see that all the time, and people fall for it. You'd be surprised how sophisticated these things get. And like Steve said, I mean, they could be sitting on your network, and you don't know it. And so they're just watching things, and as things go through, they'll take advantage of situations, such as invoice manipulation. If you're sending out an invoice to a client or a patient, all they have to do is intercept that, change out the routing and account number, and so when the patient or client goes to pay that invoice, they're not paying you; they're paying the attacker, and we've seen that before. So these are individual items that are not covered on every single policy, but can be covered. So make sure that you're at least just asking that question.
Jack, along these lines, what about third-party services? And what I mean by that is, if you're in the medical side and there's a HIPAA-related situation, and you've got to conduct an audit, and then you've got your IT company involved, and typically these aren't things that are covered under a typical agreement, especially if it came because somebody opened up an email and exposed the whole network from internal.
Mm-hmm.
Are those third-party fees covered under most typical cyber policies? In
the event of a breach, you're saying?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Typically they are, but if it's a policy or if it's a coverage that's kind of like an add-on policy to or an add-on rider or an endorsement to, say, a package policy, those are oftentimes watered down versions of cyber coverage. It's really not designed to pay for those kinds of things. What you want is a standalone cyber policy that is built to address issues and coverage items like, Steve, what you just mentioned, along with all the other items that we listed here.
Okay, thanks.
So what are people doing to prevent data breaches?
I'd say one of the biggest things is talk about it. Talk about it with your staff. Make sure that they are aware of the most latest phishing and email scams out there. We all get notices, whether it be from the IRS or whoever, that there's tax season's around the corner, and there's this new scam that's going around. So talk about it so that they email or employees don't click on something that may look legitimate but is 100% scam. 2FA. I mean, I think that goes a long way. Steve, I mean, you mentioned it's a little bit of a headache, but my gosh, I think that 2FA might be one of the single most important things that in deterring a cyber attack, in my opinion. You're the IT expert, so I'll let you chime in on that one.
Yeah, I mean, 2FA across the internally here, everything is 2FA'd. We had to do that just because companies like ours are we're in the everybody's vein right now. If you can get to us, then you can get to 500 clients. So the security measures that we've had to take internally here, with our passwords are 16 characters long, and you open up any program and it's 2FA, and so it's we went last year and across the board and put everybody that works remotely has a company device. So the only way you can access our internal network is from one of those company devices. So, I mean, those are things, and the smaller the business, the harder that becomes because of the cost that's involved in trying to implement all of those pieces. So it really does becomes very challenging. People they like the old day of when they could sit down and open up, sit at the family computer, double click on the remote desktop icon and be sitting on the server. And you just can't do that anymore. If you are, then I don't know what to say, because that's about as scary of a situation as you can possibly have.
Real quick, actually, there's a little side note question. What do you think about the services such as LastPass or the other, I'll say, password aggregators that it's like a single sign-on where you sign on to maybe your password and it consolidates all of your passwords? And is that a more secure way of protecting your passwords? Or because I mean, the whole password management issue is you talk to everybody. It's a headache. It's an absolute headache.
Password management. So, the single sign-ons are great until you have a breach to any one of those components. It's really kind of your own personal, what works for you. I mean, I can tell you, we still walk into offices and there's a sticky note on top of the server with the username and password. So, which, isn't so much a big deal in the digital world because nobody can see that. But we've also gone in offices and seen Word documents on the desktop that say passwords. So I think in that case, those single sign-ons and those password aggregators are probably a safer, especially if they're 2FA to get into any of that information. I think in today's world, everything has some inherent risk. And the biggest, I think the biggest things is to take every precaution that you can that is feasibly possible, because trying to implement everything is not possible. And it's the kind of thing right now where, if it's uncomfortable, it probably means you should be doing it. And I know that sounds terrible to anybody that's in business that says, I don't have enough time to do what I'm doing all day. I don't want 3 more layers to work through here. Unfortunately, that's kind of the price we're paying for technology today. We wouldn't be having this webinar if somebody didn't decide to start hacking people's systems and sending out emails to steal your money. And, and along those same lines, I think one of the biggest things that I would add to this is any email you get that says, click this link, don't click it.
Yeah.
So you get an email that looks like it's from Amazon, leave the email, go to Amazon, log in and check your Amazon site.
And also what I've found is that a quick Google search. So like I'll Google search if I get a fishy email, I'll Google search the subject line of that email, and sure enough, it pops up that this is a scam going around or something like that, or I'll forward that email to this proposed sender and I say, hey, is this legitimate? Did you really send me this?
Right.
And just verify. It's an extra step. It's a headache step, but it goes, just that little bit goes a long way.
And education is really huge. I'll just share a real quick little story with you. So we run a piece of software on all of our managed services clients called Huntress. And Huntress sits in the background and just basically waits to find something that's not supposed to be there, and it alerts us immediately. So the other night, and my wife was working, and she came running down the steps. I'm falling asleep in the chair, and she thinks she's been hacked, because all of a sudden she noticed that there was this file on her computer that had a string of letters and numbers. And she opened it up, and it was actually this particular company, Huntress, will put something called a canary on your computer. So it's a legitimate file with a QR code, and it tells you whatever you do, don't modify or delete this file. And she was like, I think I got hacked. And I'm like, no, you didn't get hacked. But what were you doing right prior to getting this? And she said, oh, I downloaded these 2 files that I needed from this Basecamp program. And I said, well, that's exactly right. Huntress saw an outside download come in. It threw a canary on your computer. And if that canary file got changed, it knew that it was not a legitimate file, and it would have notified us, and we could have remedied the situation very quickly. So, but the education part of it is that she's listened to me for enough years that when she sees something that doesn't look normal, she just doesn't ignore it and keep going. And that's the kind of technology that's out there today. That's the stuff that we're trying to implement on a regular basis. But again, I think the education part of it is the biggest part. If it doesn't, even if it looks right, it might not be right. And if it doesn't look right, it's definitely not right. So.
Wow, that's incredible. I didn't even know that technology was out there. And I don't know, Steve, can you talk a little bit real quick about the remote in? And because we hear about the remote in, the VPNs, and people leaving those VPNs open, and that being a huge window backdoor into networks and into systems.
Yeah, so the VPNs, I mean, it's the state of where we are with that is that the VPNs, they're a more secure way than what we used to do with just simply remote desktop. But they're only as good as the computer that they're coming from. So in the situation here with our clients, we're managing the internal networks. So we're watching everything that's going on there all the time, and we're being alerted to any of those kinds of changes.
So how much coverage should a company have? Again, it depends on the size of the practice, number of records being stored. 1 to 2 doctor practice, no less than $1 million. Multiple locations. I would consider $1 million per location. Multiple locations with like a shared server network. I would consider higher limits. Because there's ultimately more information connected together. So one attack could potentially wipe out more data. So I would definitely recommend higher limits if you've got multiple locations, shared servers, shared networks, etc.
All right, so I should be able to control it now. There we go.
Perfect.
What is the average cost of cyber liability insurance?
2020 really shook up the industry here. With the number of attacks, the amount of payouts, the ransoms, not just on large businesses, but really starting to target the small businesses, small practices, really started to increase the premiums that we were seeing. So right now, typically $1 million policy is about $1,000. We're still seeing some policies for $1 million around $600, $700, potentially $800. But if you are out there and you're looking for cyber coverage, you get a quote for about $1,000. I would not be surprised if it has all of that coverage that we have been discussing this entire time. Last year, that premium would have been closer to about $500, $600. So we've seen a significant change over the past 12 months in cost.
And are there policy procedures to implement to lower the cost of cyber liability insurance?
We've been kind of talking about this, but there's really nothing that you can do or one person can do or a business can do to lower the cost. I will say that these things, the 2FA, the working with an outside IT company, staying up to date on your firewalls and your antivirus, those are starting to become industry standard. And if they aren't implemented, then it could affect your eligibility for coverage. Not only that, we have seen cases where businesses have been charged more for a policy because they didn't have 2FA on, say, their email systems or their email accounts. Securing your backups. As Steve mentioned, some of these viruses will lay dormant for a period of time, and potentially that could cause the backups to be corrupt. So if there's a way to secure your backups, highly recommend it because that can just eliminate or reduce the cost when it comes to restoring data in the event of a breach. Steve, I don't know if you have anything to add on the capabilities of securing backups or backing up backups or anything along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, we cover as many bases as we can with that. If you're just plugging in a hard drive and taking it home, one, you're probably running a HIPAA violation there, but that's typically not encrypted. And even if it's encrypted, they can write files that do crazy things. But the reality of it is you got to be running a multi-layered security stack in your network to make sure that all of these things are okay. But it's once they get in, it's really hard to tell where you're going to be. So I would just recommend that everybody has a really good IT company that they're working with, that understand the risks that are out there today, because this is not the IT of 10 and 15 years ago. So it's not the same world anymore.
So what are the responsibilities of the business and its team to mitigate situations not covered by the insurance?
Well, first of all, if you have a cyber policy in place, first and foremost, contact your agent, contact your carrier first. Let them make the determination if coverage is applicable. Don't assume that something may or may not be covered because of the incident and the type of incident that occurred. You definitely want to get them involved and let them start working with the consultation, the attorneys, and et cetera, to make sure that the coverage, and the regulatory and the legal issues are addressed. And because ultimately you want to remain compliant, and you want to take care of your patients, employees, and do the best to protect their information moving forward. If you don't have a cyber policy, ultimately, I mean, that's on you to kind of find an attorney, to find an IT specialist to do the forensics, et cetera, and kind of work with your network to figure all that out. So, the primary thing is just to stay compliant.
So what are the first steps to take when cyber liability insurance needs to be used? And I know we've been saying this over and over, but we can reinstate it one more time.
Yep. Contact your agent, contact your insurance carrier, and let them just do their job. I know that, we've had clients that have had to use their policy, and there's a sense of fear or panic that sets in. But I promise you, as soon as they get the insurance carriers notified, as soon as the experts are called in and the attorneys are starting to do their job, and the IT people are starting to do their job, there's this huge weight that is lifted off of the practice owner's shoulders, and they can kind of get back to focusing on what they do. So just let the policy work, let the carrier do their job. It's not going to be as soon as you notify them, it's just to make it all go away. It's a process. It takes time, but just let the process happen.
And will the insurance company give recommendations of who to use in the case of a data breach?
Absolutely. There are people that and attorneys that kind of specialize in this world. So they're definitely going to work with somebody that they know and knows this space. So they'll definitely make recommendations on all of that to help you through.
And are all policies created equally? We've also gone over that too. They are definitely not, but do different carriers have the different requirements?
Underwriting requirements, they actually do. I mean, we've seen some carriers are getting more strict from an underwriting standpoint. We're seeing some still have pretty loose guidelines. The main thing is they're all going to be pretty much the same. There might be some differences here and there from an underwriting standpoint, but the main thing is the coverage. And right now, what we're seeing is the coverage that could be potentially built into an existing policy. It's just not adequate. You got to have a special policy that really truly addresses this. And the cost difference between building it into an existing plan or an existing policy versus getting it out on its own specialized policy, it's really not that much of a cost difference. You could be talking a couple $100 difference between the two.
So what do some of the common terms used in a cyber liability agreement mean?
We've been kind of going over a lot of these throughout the presentation, but really the core structure is you've got kind of your first party coverage, which is all of those items that are going to pay for the costs that you as the business owner or practice owner incur, things like notification, attorney fees, legal fees, working with your IT provider, working with another forensic IT company if that's needed, ransom attacks, paying the ransom, paying extortion fees, paying for a reward. There's actually a reward coverage now that's built into the policy. So if you want to put a reward out there for to try to track down your attacker, there's policies out there that include that coverage. All of that is what's referred to as first party coverage. Then there's third party coverage, which is kind of more of a liability type of a coverage. Different policies will address it in different ways, but that's if you're ever sued by someone who had their information compromised. It's more third party coverage. And then you have kind of your social engineering, which we referred to as you got tricked into sending somebody money, bricking, that kind of stuff. Which is bricking is simply just to reiterate, breaking of or compromising the physical hardware and where it's rendered useless and paying for that. So I'd say that those are probably some of your key definitions. And more than happy to, if anybody has any specific questions about what does this mean in my policy, happy to review it with you.
Yeah, so that flows perfectly into our next slide. If anybody has any questions about cyber liability insurance or anything regarding that field, you can absolutely drop a question in the chat now. The floor is open. And with that, I also just wanted to remind everybody that this webinar is recorded. It will be up on the replay soon through Webinar Ninja, so you should be able to get a notification for that. And just in case some people flowed in after we did our introductions, previously in the presentation, we did show a screen that had my contact information, Jack's contact information, as well as Steve's. So if you wanted to go back and reference that, you can also shoot Steve or I an email if you had any questions about DTC, webinars in general, or how to get in contact with Jack as well. So if anybody has any questions, I will turn it over to that.
Thank you.
I will tell you now that we reached this point, our power came back on.
Yeah.
Of course it did.
Yeah, and thank you to everyone that stayed on with us throughout the entire broadcast. I know that we had a few hiccups here and there, but we made it through and everything is good and well now.
Well, this wouldn't be an IT presentation without an IT, hiccup. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if there aren't any more further questions, like I said, this webinar is recorded. It will be up on the replay. It will also be uploaded soon to DTC's website, so you can find it at dtctoday.com as well as our YouTube channel. The user for that is DTC Today. And yeah, thank you all for joining us. If you guys have any closing remarks that you would like to give as well.
Thanks, Jack.
no problem. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you having me. All right.